time. All right, next topic. The War of Investitures. What a boring name for an exciting time. The War of Investitures is a very public, multi-year publicity fight between a guy, the most powerful king of Europe called the Holy Roman Emperor. He was crowned by a pope, all right, this guy named Henry IV. Henry IV is not English, he's German. And Henry IV is in charge of this entire territory. And he's so powerful that he becomes the Holy Roman Emperor by the pope, which means technically he is also the military sort of ruler. He's like the high king, if you will, of all of Western Europe, technically. Okay, that's kind of how that worked. So he is the sword arm of the Catholic Church, Henry IV, in 1073. Well, something happens. Before Henry IV became the Holy Roman Emperor, Henry IV, just like all the other kings of Western Europe, they just kind of had to put up with church rule. And what that means is that kings were not allowed to tax the church or any church property, and kings had to let the church in Rome decide who was going to be the bishops and the priests and the archbishops, people of great power inside of their own kingdom. A lot of kings kind of wish that they were the ones that got to tax the church and they got to actually choose who were the bishops of power within their kingdoms that kind of co-ruled with them. But instead, the church said, nope, we get to do that. We're the church power. You don't get to do anything, kings. We're in charge. And so Henry IV of this kind of central area called the Holy Roman Empire is going to start a publicity fight where he tries to tell the Pope that the kings should be allowed to choose their own bishops for their kingdom. And the Pope is like, nope, you can't do that. And all the other kings of Western Europe are watching this. You know that stupid, meme of Michael Jackson chewing on popcorn in a theater that somebody always puts up when an internet fight starts up? Well, basically that's what's going on. All right. All these guys for about 15 years or so, they're all watching this. And what's happening is very publicly Henry IV here in the German area is just insulting the Pope and trying to take control. And all these guys are watching. And the Pope is fighting back. How does the Pope fight back? Oh, you guys, that gets to the heart of feudalism again. Okay, so let's get started with kind of the big issues. Who gets to appoint papal authority, like bishops, in a kingdom? The Holy Roman Emperor, Henry IV, declares that Pope Gregory was not fit and demands his removal. When does that happen? Well, after a while, there was this moment of time where the Pope kept on fighting against Henry IV. And one of the things that the Pope did, which I should have put here in a bullet point, one of the things that the Pope did was he told everybody in Europe that the Holy Roman Emperor, Henry IV, no longer had God's favor. That is the power that the papacy has. In a time period when everybody went to church and looked to the church to read, to write, to tell them the will of God, to tell them how to get to heaven, right? Everybody went to the church for the morality of their lives and for the news and for assistance with anything that they needed when it came to like law and reading and writing. And so what happens is the Pope just simply sends notes to all the tens of thousands of churches throughout Europe and all of his bishops and all of his priests and says, listen, in church, I want you guys to tell all the people that King Henry IV is no longer beloved of God. Remember, in the feudal system, you've got the kings and all their vassals, but on top of the king is the person that puts God's crown on the king, divine right to rule. Who does that? The Pope, right? And so, really, the Pope is the most powerful person in all of Europe at this time. It's just sometimes kings forgot that. So the Roman Catholic Church starts up the publicity mill, and everybody starts to basically realize that Henry IV is in a battle against his very right to rule. Because if the Pope ever excommunicates Henry IV, meaning kicks him out of the church, he can no longer be a king at all. And his own people can overthrow him if they wanted to. All right, so that's the gamble. That's the dice that Henry IV is rolling when he challenges the power of the church. So one of the things that Henry IV does is he declares Pope Gregory basically insane, trying to get people to replace the Pope so that Henry IV can help encourage somebody that will support him to become the next Pope. Ultimately, Pope Gregory responds by excommunicating or kicking Henry IV out of the church 2 times during this period of time. During those times, Henry IV had to deal with revolts, had to deal with backstabbing nobles who saw this as an opportunity to take over power. All right, it was a huge mess. People not paying taxes to Henry IV in his own kingdom because they didn't think he was anymore a supported king from God. Ultimately, how does the story end? The War of Investitures. Henry IV has to go meet the Pope on his knees in the snow. The Holy Roman Emperor has to crawl on his knees to the Pope and kiss the Pope's ring. That's how the War of Investitures end. And hence the Pope wins. The Pope always wins. Okay. 1095 to 1250, this is the era of Crusades. We're not going to get too much into this yet. That's the last main topic. I just wanted to note that now the Crusades are on, so a lot of the time that I talk here, we're going to be mentioning that there's Crusades. Okay, well, screw it. All right, so between 1095 to 1250, there is this era of Crusades that happens, and there's 2 places where Crusades are. There's the Eastern Crusades, which are English troops and French soldiers and German soldiers that are going to send people, mostly on the promise of salvation, land, and money from the church, to go east to Jerusalem and conquer it for the Christian Roman Church. So basically, they're going to war. These Christians who don't really have a lot going on for themselves over in Europe at this time go to war against the Palestines and the Muslims of Palestine, Jerusalem, modern day Libya, Syria, Jordan, Israel. Sorry about that. In 1095, there's also going to be another crusade that starts up. So there's 2 crusades. There's 2 geographic regions of crusade. There's the Eastern Crusades that go over to the Holy Lands where Jerusalem is. And then there's the Spanish Reconquista. This is a crusade that takes place entirely in Spain. It starts and is authorized at the same exact time in 1095. So in 1095, there's a choice if you want to go fight and die and go to heaven because of your going on crusade. You can go to Jerusalem or you can go to Spain. Either way, you're fighting and killing Muslims, which, according to the church, sent you to heaven. All right. So here's where the Spanish Crusade, the Reconquista, is, and here's where the Holy Land Crusades go. So here we are between 1095 to 1099. You got your first crusade, and that first crusade is very successful in taking peasants and freemen and soldiers from Europe and sending them all the way through Constantinople, where they stopped to supply, because this is the easternmost Christian capital, and then sent them into here where these Christian soldiers then conquered this region. Now, they only hold on to this region for about 80 years, and then the Muslim Empire comes back and kicks them out of it. What's important about the Crusades is not so much about the fighting, although that is its own study. What's important is that when the fighting wasn't happening, people followed the routes that all these soldiers paved, and they traded. So for the first time since the fall of Rome, thanks to these kind of dumb, really, crusades, what's going to happen is there's going to be a real and very important trade that begins between the Muslims of the East and the Christians of the West. And it's all people trading along the trade routes that are set up here. And there's neutral parties that can kind of go between. Since the Roman Empire fell hundreds of years before, Western Europe has been cut off largely from Eastern trade. But now, because of the Crusades, Western Europe is going to be reconnected to Eastern trade. This is the other crusade. There is a Muslim kingdom in Spain called the Caliphate of Cordoba. This Muslim kingdom owns most of the peninsula of Spain. So in 1095, the Kingdom of Leon, which is also Spain, and Castile, which is also Spain now, these two small kingdoms join together, and they get the Pope to tell them that they get to go on crusade too. So we have two crusades. We have the main crusades over here, and we have the Reconquista happening over here. Okay? This guy here is King Henry II. I know that there's lots of Henrys, and Henry was a very popular name in Europe. So we'll always say things like Henry of England or Henry of France, because otherwise it gets too confusing. When I talked about the investitures between the Pope and Henry IV, that Henry was German. Okay, so that's German Henry IV. So the English king, Henry II, all right, is going to become the king of England about 100 years after the Norman conquest. So he is a Norman descendant in England. He speaks French and Saxon English. Henry II, right during the time as we get into the crusading period, Henry II of England is going to be a very modern king for his kingdom, for England. He is going to do a bunch of stuff, including creating a court system, a modern court system for Western Europe that other countries will actually copy. And that means he's going to have a jury. People were no longer going to be allowed to fight trials of combat. They actually had to have a court case, right? That sort of thing. So Henry II does a lot of modern reforms of the court system, at least for his time. One of the controversial things he does is he passes this thing called the Constitution of Clarendon. The Constitution of Clarendon gives the king the right to haul church people in England, like bishops and priests, into the king's new court system and try what the king would call church criminals in the king's court. Now, from that time, even all the way up until the modern day, the Catholic Church tries to assert its right to actually try church criminals in church courts instead of having them tried in secular courts. Obviously, in the modern day and in the medieval world, kings and nobles and lawmakers didn't like that much, because if you were a bishop or a priest in England and you commit a crime, then the people there want justice. They don't want to see you like hauled away to Rome where you disappeared, or just like renamed and put in charge of some of the church in some other part of Europe, which is pretty much what happened. And so look in the 1980s in the United States. Oh my gosh. And the early 90s, huge fight between U.S. lawmakers against the Catholic Church and the habit of the Catholic Church to find church molester, child molesters in the church. And before the secular authorities could get a hold of them, those guys were renamed and sent to other parts of the world to take over churches. The United States, the legal system could not do anything about it. Oh man. Well, that's only partially changed now. All right. The church still has that kind of power, which I think is interesting, even here in the United States. Not as much as it used to, but it still tries to exert that power here, and it still has full powers in some other countries. The other thing that this constitution allowed the English king Henry II to do in the 12th century was to tax the church. And we now have that meme again of Michael Jackson eating popcorn in a movie theater. All right. Everybody is watching. What is going to happen? Well, the reason why King Henry of England thought he could do this is because the most powerful bishop, an archbishop in England, the one that was in charge of the church in England, was his best friend. King Henry's best friend was Thomas Becket, Archbishop of Canterbury, the highest bishop in all of England. So here's the story, real quick, all right? Constitution of Clarendon gives the king the right to tax the church and to haul church officials into English courts for secular trial. The clergy is uncomfortable. Henry II tries to get around an uncomfortable church by donating money to the brand new crusades that were starting, to the first crusade. And then Thomas Becket comes along. So Thomas Becket, Archbishop of Canterbury, most powerful church authority in all of England. Henry II of England has to rule alongside Thomas Becket. Well, Thomas Becket grew up with Henry II and was one of his best friends, but Thomas Becket revolted against Henry II of England when Henry passed the Constitution of Clarendon. Because if Henry II got away with limiting church power in England, then other kings could do it too. And Becket understood that as a church official. So no matter how much he loved his best friend, the king, Thomas Becket, as Archbishop, had to choose who he was going to join, the church or the king. And Becket was a church guy. So there's this controversy that rages throughout England that BuzzFeed and other clickbait rumor mills would have loved during this period of time. Just constant he said, she said, and oh my gosh, can you believe? Right? Because Becket and Henry were writing legal letters to each other, arguing with each other, publicly stating things in palaces and churches. It was a mess, okay? Just great turmoil in England, all right? Finally, Henry II almost hauls Becket into a court where Becket could have been tried for high treason and possibly burned at the stake. And so Becket flees and runs to France. But then, for some reason, Becket came back. He came back to England in the middle of all of this. And Becket starts up the fight again. And Henry II is so annoyed that he throws a tantrum and yells, "Who will rid me of this priest?" And at that time, 4 knights who had sworn oaths of fealty to the king took this as an order. And on December 29th of 1170, they entered with their weapons Canterbury Cathedral, and it was late at night, and they murdered Thomas Becket. And people saw this. Priests were there, and some peasants were there and stuff, and they saw this happen. And Becket played it to the very end. He martyred himself. He waited upstairs in his rectory while the soldiers were downstairs waiting for him. And Becket came down with his palms together, praying in a white robe of innocence. And I mean, he played this up. Just really did it, knowing that he was going to be observed martyring himself for what he thought was right. And so Becket does become a martyr. He is sainted by the church within a year. Guys, if you don't know much about this, it usually takes decades for a martyr to become a saint in the Catholic Church, someone that people pray to and all that. Well, Becket's body is buried inside of Canterbury Cathedral. It is still there. And people from all over the Christian world came to visit and pray at this burial. Oh, Becket, who was martyred for God, and Henry II just suffers the biggest PR defeat in royal history at that time, at least for England. All right, so Henry II does penance, meaning he asks for forgiveness, loses power, and during this entire time, people like pilgrims are coming to pray at Becket's shrine and cursing Henry of England for what his soldiers did, you know. And so Becket's name is used by the church to basically say, "Hey, we always win these fights, you people. We always win." And if you went to Canterbury, actually today you still can. If you go to Canterbury Cathedral in 1170, or you do it today, they will give you trinkets cast in stone, pewter cast in stone, with Thomas Becket right there, or being murdered by knights or whatever. This is the latest version right here. Thomas Becket in his burial chamber. Anyway, that brings us to the next topic. We're going to move to the sons of Henry II. This is a fascinating family, all right? The sons of Henry II are not... you put these two together and you still have a bad ruler, all right? These guys both screwed things up. There's a lot of popularity in modern, meaning since the 1950s, a lot of popularity in the idea that Richard the Lionheart was a really good and just king, and that John, which you almost see it in the image, was this total jerk who was hated by all the people. In reality, they both were terrible as kings of England. They were overindulged children of Henry II. Here is what England looked like when these two took over. Richard and John together were the ruling family, the Norman ruling family, that had control of a good portion of what is England right here, a little bit of Ireland, okay, and half of modern day France, a little more than half of modern day France. This had been taken by English kings since William of Normandy. These guys take over and they lose all of it. They lose everything. All right. So what happens? Richard III spent 3 months in England. The rest of the time, Richard III was gallivanting around France and also over in the Holy Lands because he went on crusade. John was left home to run England while Richard was gone. The problem is that Richard was always gone. So so John basically was kind of the king in absentia. He was the one that had to tell all the nobles that they had to raise money by overtaxing all their citizens to pay for Richard to go play. Okay, so that's what's going on. It sucked for him. He had an impossible situation, and he was already not going to be a good ruler anyway. This is just a good image. This is actually nicknamed the Angevin territory, the English French territory. All the territory run by the King of England. All right, here we go. The notes. So Richard, the King of England, is gone in France and the Holy Lands most of his reign. John is not in charge, but he would really like to be. He makes a deal with King Philip of France to support a takeover. Now, what this means, guys, is that King John is going to talk to the King of France over here in Paris. And King John is going to say, listen, Richard's been gone for years. And we're charging money. It really sucks. It's kind of dumb. What if you and I join together and talk to the Pope and said that the Pope needs to transfer the crown to me, to John? And in return, I will give you some of this territory for France again. Some of this territory can become French again. And the King of France kind of says, okay, for a little while. And then finally, when King John wasn't really paying much attention, the King of France, thinking that maybe John had become really weak now, because John, when John told the King of France that he needed the King of France's help to get Richard deposed by the church so that Richard would no longer be king, John was also at the same time telling the King of France how John was really weak because King Richard took all the best troops to go fight in a crusade. And John is overtaxing his people to pay for Richard to go fight in a crusade. What that means is John is freaking weak, dude. And so the King of France instead is going to raise an army and he's going to go to fight to capture all the English territory in France. And the King of France does. Okay? Um, well, in this war, where the King of France is conquering its own territory from the English, really, from 1202 to 1204, 2 years, King John loses almost all English territory in France. It is a total upset. It's very embarrassing to the ruling family of England. And finally, King Richard returns with fanfare. He comes back. I am here again. We will regain the French territory, for I am the one that knows how to fight. And King Richard did know how to fight. And Richard and John went to France and they began fighting to retake English territory in France. And then Richard is killed by a French crossbow bolt, and that ends, and that's over. That's it. Okay? So Richard's now dead, and John's now the king. So what's John going to do with it? All right? John's now the king, and he's going to be trying to get territory back. The French king, Philippe, is actually preparing to send a Norman-style army, just like it was 100 years before with Duke William, to actually send an army into England and capture it. That's how weak England has become. So between 1204 to 1214, let's do the expanded war. Richard dies. King John loses church support and even gets excommunicated for a while. All right. John has to raise more money and give that money to the Pope to become king again. The Pope finally, after John sends a ton of taxpayer money to the Pope, Philip, the King of France, finally stops planning his invasion of England. All right. John regains zero territory All right, but at least he keeps England. Partially it's bad luck, and mostly it's just really bad rule by two kids who don't know what the heck they're doing. So this is English territory in France when Henry II died, and this is English territory in France by the time that King John's dead. So John's not very popular, partially because he lost half of England's territory entirely, and also because to do that and to fight his wars and to pay for Richard's, gallivanting about, John has to tax people heavily, and they got tired of it, and the nobles were tired of it too. The barons of England who were in charge of territory, they were having to face revolts of the common people who were being overtaxed, and so the barons were tired of it too. Finally, the only real thing that King John does that really, helps him out is King John destroys a French invasion fleet in 1214. That's all King John is able to successfully do. And when he comes back to England in 1214, the barons are in revolt, meaning the nobles of England are in revolt because the people of England are about to overthrow the barons of England, all right, the nobles. So in 1215, King John gets off of his ship, and a bunch of nobles surround him, and they say, "You need to sign this piece of paper." And this piece of paper is called the Magna Carta. And what it does is it says this: King John, if you want to still be king, because we're about to actually overthrow you, we will cut your head off and we will put some other noble in charge. So if you want to keep on being king, which is easier for us anyway, from a legal standpoint, we just need you to sign this. And what this is going to do is it's going to limit your power. No one can be imprisoned without a trial by a jury. So habeas corpus, if you've ever heard of that, meant that people could not be held in jail without a reason. 2, the king must consult all the nobles of England before raising taxes. 3, the king must choose competent officials who understand and obey the law. 4, the king could not interfere with or limit the freedoms of the church. This was added so that the church would support this limiting of royal authority, which they did. 5, most importantly, the Magna Carta requires that everyone, even the king, had to obey the law. All right. So there are some things that happen over the next 200 years. Really, there's going to be fighting between kings of England and the nobles of England based on who is or is not going to actually follow the Magna Carta. John will try not to, obey the Magna Carta, and eventually the English nobles join in with France to actually fight a civil war to just get rid of King John. And ultimately, King John dies of old age in 1216, and because of that, there is no civil war. Cutting out a lot of the middleman here that's not important in this. If you want to know more, we have a history of England class. In 1264, all right, some years later, Simon de Montfort, a noble of England, notice he has a French name, organizes the first ever parliament, which is all the nobles meeting together regularly to rule England with the king. This is called a constitutional monarchy, and parliament is only going to get more powerful from that time on. Today, the Queen of England, Queen Elizabeth II, you know what her job is? She is basically a figurehead, right? She has no ruling authority, really, because Parliament has all of it now. And the one real authority that Queen Elizabeth has is she is the person in charge of the Church of England. She's like the Pope for England. Okay, so that's it. That's really all that a ruler has now. Now kings are still super powerful back here, and they're going to continue to be super powerful all the way into the 1700s. But this is the beginning of the change in England that is going to lead to a much better, I think, for the people, constitutional monarchy, because it begins to turn England into a type of democracy that will develop over time that leads not only to the English Empire, but it also leads eventually to the United States. So that all begins right here with the Magna Carta. All right, let's go ahead and talk about the Crusades again. We're just going to get a little bit more specific. So, as I mentioned before, there were two geographic areas where Crusades were happening. Crusades being a type of holy war. There was the ones in the Holy Lands between 1090 to 1250. There were crusades after 1250. This is just the range of the important ones that actually had some kind of historic effect. And then we've got the Reconquista happening in Spain between 1090 and 1492. How do the Crusades go? Just a little more detail. In 1099, French, English, a number of Germanic soldiers capture the major cities of that western coast of the Middle East, including Jerusalem. That's when they capture it. Everybody was killed inside the city. Every citizen, every Muslim citizen of Jerusalem and their families and their animals were all wiped out. That was the crazy fervor that the Christians had at the time. In 1187, Jerusalem was recaptured by a Muslim leader called Saladin. When Jerusalem was recaptured, all the Christians that surrendered were simply allowed to go back to Europe. They were not killed. They were protected on their way out of Muslim territory. Whenever you tell that story, you got to realize that there's no way for the. After failing to take back Jerusalem in the Second and Third Crusades, unarmed Christians were allowed to visit the city's holy places freely, which they still are today. So the effects of the Crusades on feudal society, I'm not going to give you a lot of bullet points here. I'm just going to say this. Trade. All of these lines are trade. And these trades are linked to cities. And some of those cities got really, really big, really, really fast, very populated cities because they were all linked to trade that were coming along with old Crusader routes. This entire region was cut off. Actually, I shouldn't mention this because it was still connected, the Muslim part of Spain. All of Christian Western Europe was almost entirely cut off from Eastern trade since the Roman Empire fell back around 400. Well, the deal is, guys, is that thanks to the new Crusader routes, although there was some violence, there was also trading partnerships that started up. And those trading partnerships, as I mentioned before, are now going to bring goods into Europe that Europe has not seen in a long time. And Europe is going to be able to sell things to the East as well. And as a result, trade happens. There is one trading partnership called the Hanseatic League. The Hanseatic League is this kind of German, Central European trading center that is going to be run by some really major families. The Medicis of Italy, Florence, Venice, for instance, are all part of the Hanseatic League, as is Brussels, and parts of Denmark and stuff. They're all part of the Hanseatic League. And this was a major trading empire that basically handled creating the sorts of things that were going to be sold on the Silk Road, on the newly established trading routes as a result of the Crusades. What's going to happen is there's going to be lots of people, serfs and peasants, who actually leave their farms and all that to go work in the cities. There's going to be population booms in all these cities. And what that means is that there's greater trade. There's universities that start up, trade fairs where people can go buy things that they could never access before the Crusades. Medieval towns growing, crowded towns because the towns just sort of grew without there being any real additions of modern conveniences. Guys, sanitation was a huge issue. People could not bathe that much. Clean water wasn't as easy to find as you would like, especially in a very populated area where there were no real rules on clean water use. The worst part is that in the cities, I mean, the rural areas were okay, but in the cities, the way people handled their waste was to use a chamber pot. They did number ones or number twos into a pot in their room. And when that pot was full, they simply dumped it out the window or out back, which means that over the course of decades, as these cities were getting bigger and bigger thanks to trade, you guys, the sanitation was really bad. And people were just used to living in their own waste. It just became a part of life. But what that means is that if a disease comes along, like, say, the bubonic plague that people weren't used to, that was carried by flies and fleas and rats that all thrive in bad sanitation, right? Then it's going to be impossible to stop them. And that means that at some point, 34 million Europeans are going to die thanks to the Black Plague. All right. And it's partially it's an irony. All the trade that happens here that creates whole new families of power and creates wealthy cities and a revived Europe and all this stuff. It really is the beginning of the Renaissance, and in some of the cities, right? Even by 1250, you've got the Renaissance starting in some places, and this is happening. And then along the same trade routes comes the Black Plague, and that bubonic plague, the Black Death, is going to just wipe out all the gains made by all these people. Just 34 million die in 10 years. All right, that's in 1350 to 1340. So during this pre-plague times, you've got actual friendly trading with Muslims, right? You've got universities like Cambridge and Oxford and Paris being created, where it's not just church people going to school; it's now wealthy kids of nobles. You got a middle class starting up that's going to be handling all that trade for you, and the church is just becoming ever more powerful. All right, the church is super powerful. So when we meet next, we're going to talk about how that bubonic plague shows up and the waves of effect of the bubonic plague as we move into the Renaissance. Okay, thanks a lot.